Today we have with us Shane Parrish. I've been a huge fan of Shane's for a long time, reading Farnham Street, his blog, and then also I'm actually a really big fan of the books he's put out thus far around mental models, which we'll kind of dive into a little bit later on. He's also got a podcast called The Knowledge Project, which is definitely worth a listen. But today we're going to be talking about his new book, which is called Clear Thinking: Turning Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Results. So Shane, hey, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. I'm excited to be here.
I'm curious about the tagline of this book, which is about ordinary moments. People don't talk a lot about ordinary moments. Why is that something that you're focusing on, and why do, quote, ordinary moments matter? And what are ordinary moments?
Well, I think, generally speaking, we get the big decisions sort of directionally correct, right? We think about who we're going to marry, where we're going to live, what career we're going to go into. And the point is that we're thinking about those moments. So we tend to be a bit more rational than other moments. But these ordinary moments have the ability to undo all of those choices. And we don't think of those as choices or decisions, or we don't even realize that the situation is thinking for us. Great example of that is sort of like, I think something a lot of people can relate to. If you have a partner at home, one of you probably loads the dishwasher one way and the other one loads the dishwasher the other way.
But well, you always load it the right way, right, Shane?
I always load it the wrong way. But, just imagine Friday night, you've had a long week, you sort of come home, and then all of a sudden you're arguing about this dishwasher, and it just slowly escalates, right? It starts with a passive aggressive comment, and then your partner does the same thing. And then before you know it, you're like not talking to each other, or you're in this big tiff. And if I were to tap you on the shoulder, well, that was happening, Kyle. And I said, hey, you're about to put water or gas on this situation. What do you want to do? Mm-hmm. You'd be like, oh, I want to put water on this. But that would get you out of this thinking. So the whole point is, there's a lot of moments and situations where we're not thinking. The situation is thinking for us. And so those are ordinary moments, and they have the ability to undo all of these big choices we make. You can pick the best partner, but if you don't invest in that relationship and you're an asshole at home, then it's going to multiply by zero. You're going to wake up to divorce papers. You can pick the best career and the best company to work for, but if you don't show up and work your butt off, you're going to get fired. And so all these ordinary moments add up.
Gotcha. I loved a point that you made in the book. You talk about one of the reasons why best performers make good decisions is because they're not forced into bad decisions. And you talk about this concept of positioning and how it can help us. So what is positioning, and how can it help us make clearer, better decisions?
Yeah. So through studying some of the titans, if you will, of decision making, I came to this conclusion that you don't really need to be smarter than other people to outperform them if you can outposition them. And so anyone sort of looks like a genius when they're in a good position, and even the smartest people look like an idiot when they're in a poor position. And one thing I realized is that some of the people that we hold up as sort of the titans of decision making, like Warren Buffett, he's just never out of position. A great example is today. He's got $150 billion on his balance sheet. If the stock market goes up, he wins. If it stays the same, he wins. If it tanks, he wins. He wins no matter what happens. He is a master of his circumstances rather than being mastered by them.
With Buffett specifically, I seem to remember during the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, because he was in a good position, he was able to make some really good moves, right?
Yeah. And if you look at history, that's what tends to happen. The people who build really amazing companies are playing offense when everybody else is forced into survival mode. If you look at Carnegie and Rockefeller, they did most of their expansion during panics and downturns, and they always had dry powder available because they realized they couldn't predict with any degree of certainty what was going to happen, and that unexpected things will happen. I mean, if history teaches us nothing, it is that unexpected things will happen. We can't predict them, but we can position ourselves to prosper no matter what happens.
Thinking about it, like if I'm running a business and I'm thinking about ensuring that I'm in a good position, what does that mean? Does that just mean that I'm a little bit more conservative than I otherwise could be? Or
well, it means that you're not going all in on one particular angle, right? So a great example is Paul Graham has the concept of default alive or default dead. Well, if you're default alive, you're in a strong position. You're making money. And if you're default dead, you're in a weak position because you need to raise money at some point. You're losing money. And there's a whole bunch of examples of positioning that apply to work and life. A great example is, a lot of people are parents. One of my kids came home with a poor test one day, and he looked at me, he handed it to me, and he said, I did my best. He like scuffed by, as like teenagers will do. And then I was like, oh, I'm not going to talk about this right now, but I want to talk, what does it mean to do your best, right?
Yeah.
And so later on that night, we sat down and I was like, hey, you said you did your best. I want to know what that means. And he said, well, in the moment, I sat down at 10, I read all the questions, I answered them to the best of my ability. And so often, this is how we think of decisions. We think of the decision starting at 10. And I'm like, hold on, let's rewind here. Did you get a good night's sleep? No. Did you argue with your brother? Yes. Mm-hmm. Did you have a good breakfast? No. Did you study in the 3 days before?
Yeah, I was like, what about that studying too? Yeah.
Right? No. So I was like, you didn't put yourself in a good position, and all of those things you control, but all of those factor into the result, but we never think about them because they come before the moment that we think of as a decision. And none of this stuff happens when you have a personal crisis, an emotional crisis, a financial crisis. You don't get to go home and prepare. There's no advance warning when COVID hits. It just hits, and you have to deal with it as you are. And so the concept of positioning is that you're never going to think clearly if the situation is thinking for you, and you can't think clearly unless you're positioned to actually be able to think in the moment.
Because if you're poorly positioned, you only have to choose between a few bad options.
Yeah.
And if you're well positioned, then you could just do nothing and be fine, or you could choose to take advantage of an opportunity.
And so this is what I realized, that, a lot of us actually make pretty decent decisions. Where we go wrong is when we're forced by circumstance, or we're forced by our emotions, or sort of our defaults into doing something that we don't want to do. And so how do the best people in the world operate? Well, they position themselves well, and they have great temperament. And so these two things combined allow them to think clearly and think independently.
Think about this from a parent. I've got 2 young kids right now, and we just got back from some long travels, and good positioning whenever you're traveling with like toddlers is just like a lot of extra time. I'm just building a ton of extra time in. And you know what? I'm not angry. I'm not frustrated. I'm not whatever. I'm actually just able to show up and be present and be like, okay, yeah, that of course, 3 things took way longer than they should, but we have plenty of time, and I'm not like showing up from a place of like deficit and frustration and anger before I even get on the plane,
100%. Like, positioning applies to so much in life, right? Your relationship with your partner, if you invest in that, you're going to be well positioned to sort of weather a storm. But if you take it for granted, the smallest spark is going to light it on fire. Sleep is another example of positioning, right? We don't think of that as affecting our decisions the next day, or the quality of our life, or the quality of our responses. But we know that if we're not sleeping, we're not eating healthy, we're not working out, sort of these things you control, eating well, working out, all these things affect your position. In the context of business, you can think of margin of safety, inventory levels, raw material, multiple suppliers, like all of these things position you to withstand the inevitable ups and downs that are going to come.
We kind of touched on this a little bit in this last question, but I want to talk more kind of like head on about what the enemies of clear decision making are. You talk about some of these defaults that we have that make us, okay, so we're, especially when we're poorly positioned, these defaults kind of like come out more frequently, but it probably couldn't when we're well positioned. The emotional default, the ego default, the social default, and the inertia default.
So what they have in common is that they all reduce the odds that you're actually thinking. And individually, they're powerful, and together they're a force to be reckoned with. And they happen in big moments, and they happen in ordinary moments. The first two, sort of emotional and ego, are really about controlling the urges that get us into trouble. And the second two are about recognizing situations that think for us rather than thinking for ourselves. So we all know Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the key tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous is called HALT, which is hungry, angry, lonely, tired. You're likely to make poor choices about alcohol when you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. You're likely to make poor choices in general when any of those things is true. And so it's recognizing that, but it's also avoiding it. I mean, it's one thing to sort of say, You have to recognize when you're angry and make good choices. And, that might work like 20% of the time. But in the book, we talk about safeguards that you can put into place so that you avoid getting angry in the first place. And if you do get angry, you can create automatic rules for yourself because we're taught to follow rules. And that can circumvent our anger for what to do in a particular situation. And I think that we just don't think about that enough in terms of like, I want to avoid this situation. If I can't avoid this situation, I want to override my default. I don't want to rely on willpower to get myself out of it because eventually everybody loses the battle with willpower.
The best willpower is willpower you don't have to use, right?
100%. So how do we get out of using that to the least amount possible?
Exactly right. The ability to if you can only do sprints of willpower, that's the best case scenario. If you only have to use willpower very sparingly, then you're likely to actually be able to succeed.
Well, how often when you're sending an angry email, I'm sure you've done this to somebody. How often?
Oh, I've never sent an angry email. Never. That's not my style at all.
And how often do you sort of catch yourself in the moment going, I probably shouldn't send this? No, you feel righteous and you feel just and you feel like, you're going to get this off your chest. And,
Yeah, they need to hear this. And this.
And what does that do? This is an ordinary moment, right? That happens all the time, millions of times a day across the United States where somebody's doing that. And what they're doing in that moment is they're not thinking. If I were to tap you on the shoulder while you're typing that email and say, hey, just water or gas, you'd be like, water. I'm going to choose water. But in that moment, you're not thinking. That ordinary moment can derail so much of all the progress you've made.
For me, on the HALT scale, tired is the key one. I am best in the morning, and I'm a super I wake up in the morning. I'm the most optimistic person you've ever met. It's going to be a great day. And by the time I'm laying down to bed, I'm kind of like a little bit of a curmudgeon. Yeah. My optimism goes down over the day, and the energy goes down over the day. So there certainly are instances where having a legitimate, serious conversation is coming up at the end of the day. And sometimes I'm just like, hey, I want to talk about this. This is important, but I promise you I will be a better person to talk about this with in 12 hours.
Yeah, totally. You can also create an automatic rule. We talked about this before, which is it's my rule not to talk about anything like this in the afternoon. Let's talk about it tomorrow morning.
After 9:30, I can't have any good conversations.
Function. Yeah. It's really important. I just want to hit on the rules for a second because we're taught our whole life to follow rules, right? Here's the speed limit. Here's the tax code. You break those rules, you're punished. And so we inherently just follow them. We never think about them. They just become something that we follow. But we've never really thought about how we can use rules ourselves to change our behavior so that we don't think in the moment. We just follow the rule that we've created for ourselves. And one of the defaults is sort of the social default. A great example of that is you're out for dinner. You're with a whole bunch of people, you're celebrating, but you want to eat healthy. And so you can create a rule about not eating dessert. And I think that this is great because everybody's going to pressure you into, if it's willpower, you have to make a choice. And that choice is relying on your willpower. And then you're going to say no to people. So you have social pressure going on. But what if you just turn around and say, hey, my rule is I don't eat dessert? People aren't going to push back on you and you're not going to push back on yourself. And so you're going to accomplish.
I guess, help me understand the difference between setting a rule and having willpower. Because it seems like it does take willpower to say, my rule is,
no,
I don't eat dessert. Yeah.
Does it take willpower to follow the speed limit? No, once you have the rule, your brain just automatically sort of circumvents everything and follows the rule. Generally speaking, yes, we all speed, but you just default to, I know the speed limit, I'm going to follow the speed limit. You're not consciously thinking about it. So when you set the rule, the first time you use it, you just have to say that's my rule. But the second, third, fourth time, it just becomes easier and easier. And then eventually it becomes automatic. It's not willpower based. And I got this idea from Daniel Kahneman when I was at his penthouse. He answered the phone and he said on the phone, he's like, my rule is I don't say yes on the phone. And he hung up and I was like, I'm so curious about that. Tell me about that. And he's like, well, I found that when people are asking me to talk or blurb a book or do all these things that I was always saying yes, but I never wanted to do it. I just didn't want to disappoint them. And I think everybody can sort of relate to this. So he's like, I created a rule that I would never say yes on the phone. And I was like, so what happened? He's like, well, now I say yes about 10% of the time instead of 70% of the time.
He's probably got a very rule-based way to say a kind no.
Yeah. And it was like, so what other rules do you have? He's like, oh, I don't think of it that way. And I was like, what? This is like such a powerful concept. How can we apply this to other areas of our life?
Yeah, I think that makes me think. Have you read Essentialism by Greg McKeown?
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but there's just like there's a lot of stuff in there about saying no, setting boundaries, and like creating those rules that just like I just don't do that, and then you become the person that doesn't do that, and it's not a hard thing.
Yeah, you can tie it to your identity for sure, right? I'm not the type of person who eats dessert. A rule is the same sort of way to do that and accomplish a goal. Yeah.
One phrase that jumped out at me that I'd love to hear you explain. And it's called the brute force ceiling. It was just like a throwaway in in a sentence, but I was really curious about that concept. What is it? Have you ever hit it?
Yeah, totally. So this idea, the ceiling of brute force, comes from a good friend of mine, Brent Bashore. And it's when somebody is just the center of everything. So they have no leverage. If you think of operating a business, it's like every decision goes through you. You micromanage everything. Everything flows through you. And that can work if you're like 5 people or 6 people, but there's a ceiling at which that falls apart. And that often caps the potential of a business. If you can't delegate, if you can't trust, if you can't hire people, if you can't scale, if you can't leverage your time, then all of a sudden you're going to reach the ceiling of brute force. So there's only so much effort, only so much energy you can put into things. And it's going to cap the performance of the business at a certain level, and you won't be able to get behind it. Or you won't be able to get beyond it.
One of the things that I find that's a paradox about this brute force ceiling is the thing that has made you successful to the point where you hit that ceiling is just working harder. Like I put in more hours than other people. I care more. I work harder. And that you get all the pats on the back for that. From management, you get the bonuses and you get the higher salary. If you're owning the business, you see like higher revenue, higher growth, whatever. And then there's a point at which the thing that has got you here is not going to is going to actually hold you back from going forward.
Yeah, we often think about working harder as the number of hours we're working, but working harder can also be working smarter. If you can outsmart your competition, if you can outthink them, if you can leverage yourself, that's a form of working harder. And in that case, I mean, a lot of the reasons that people invest in, the stock market is because these companies are working for them 24 hours a day. That's a form of leverage, and that's a form of having, other people work for you. It's the same thing that applies in business. And I think that not only, I mean, we're taught our whole life, at least if people are like me, it's like the solution to every problem is to work harder.
Absolutely.
And that works. But that works for most situations, right? It works for most situations in school. It works for most situations in university. And then you get into an organization, it works for career advancement. But when you start running a business, working harder has a ceiling to it. And that ceiling has never become apparent to you because you've been taught your whole life, all you need to do is put your head down and grind, and you'll eventually get through it. And there's some truth to that. But when it comes to running a business, you have to leverage your time. You have to delegate decisions. You have to trust people if you want to go farther. Otherwise, you'll reach the ceiling.
The way we talk about it internally with my team is we're long-term lazy. We want to put in a lot of work now, the smarter type of work now, which means we got to do the thing. And then we got to do 30% extra work to like build the system so that the thing is easier to do next time. So I always try to, I'm always thinking about like, how can, I would much prefer to add a little bit extra effort that is making the next time way easier, which I think is on the smarter side of working rather than just like, okay, let's power through it and add more clients and add more, work into the system.
Yeah. And often that breaks the system, right? It's not about feeding more people into it. It's like there's a certain pace at which you should grow. I have this saying that a lack of patience changes the outcome.
Tell me more.
And, when we know how to accomplish the outcome that we want, often we just try to speed it up. And it's that process of speeding it up that gets us into a lot of trouble. Like we know how to get financially independent. We save more money than we spend and we invest it. Dollar cost average it into an index fund and wait 40 years and keep going like every month. And that is a surefire. That's about as sure of a way to get rich as you can think of. And yet nobody wants to do it because that's long-term and not short-term. I want to get rich next week. And it's that lack of patience that gets us into trouble.
Let's talk about environments. How do we create environments where our desired behavior becomes our default behavior?
Yeah. So when we think of environments, it's interesting. We think of our physical environment, but we have the ability to create artificial environments too. So you can think of physical as being like if you're trying not to use your phone, you want to concentrate, leaving it in another room. So you've altered your physical environment in order to make more friction for the undesired behavior and allow less friction, the path of least resistance, to be the desired behavior. But we can also think about our mental sort of environment, right? So we talked about rules, a rule around your phone. If you're out to dinner with somebody, you could be like, my rule is I don't check my phone. So now you're creating an artificial environment that's helping you with your desired behavior because you want to be present in that. And you can look at your environment through multiple lenses. And we never think of it that way because when people say the word environment, they just think, oh, my physical environment. But it's like, who am I hanging out with? Because eventually I'm going to become like those people. And I think we all know that, but we're not conscious of those choices that we make and the impact they have. But it's also like who we read online. And what inputs we have into our brain, because those inputs determine our downstream thoughts. And we don't think about that, but that's a form of environment. What environment is our brain operating in? What inputs are we allowing into it? Are they high signal and low noise? Or are they inputs designed to make us feel something or react in a certain way? Because that's going to dictate sort of our behavior. It's going to dictate our ability to think. It's going to dictate the thoughts and actions that we do later in that day. And we're not going to think about that. So that's another way of sort of like positioning where something comes before the moment of decision and it impacts the decision. And we're not thinking of that in terms of how it allows us to think clearly in the moment.
The knowledge diet piece is actually really interesting. I mean, like obviously a big critique of our social media age is that we're getting a crazy amount of inputs that we've never had before, and they tend to be from people that think exactly like us, or are pushing us in a certain direction. And so, a person that may, 50 years ago have read their local newspaper and watched the 6 o'clock news, and maybe whatever, for better or for worse, a more balanced and gate kept system. And there's an ability to have a discourse with your neighbor, even if they were Republican and Democrat, because you have the same general knowledge base. And that's like obviously getting harder.
I think we get ourselves in a bubble, but that bubble to us looks exactly like the world looks like. So we don't even notice it. And you can think about this in a different way. Like, let's apply it to a situation today that's probably happening all around the world, which is a lot of governments haven't ordered their people back to work. And what does that mean? Like, let's walk through the second, third, order consequences of that and relate that to how we see the world. So if I don't go to work and I'm zooming in, I'm not forced to sort of deal with the downtown, or I'm not forced to deal with a wide variety of society. All of a sudden, I turn off my Zoom, I get my groceries delivered, I get my food delivered, I hang out with my friends, but my friends all think like I do. They look like I do. They act like I do. They're in the same socioeconomic status as I am. The world starts to look a lot like us. And what happens in that case? Well, I don't think about the people who are less fortunate than us. I don't think about how the downtown core might be affected or people are losing their jobs because I don't see it. And because I don't see it, I'm insulated from it. And how can you have people set policy if they're insulated from a wide variety of society? And so you can take that concept of the world looking like us and you can apply it to sort of how policy changes and how people start enacting. How can you have a government that's not interacting with its citizens on a daily basis in person?
All right, I want to go back to something we touched on in positioning, and kind of relate it a little bit more to the startup world. So I want to talk about the concept of margin of safety. In startups, like so many companies are either internally motivated or externally motivated from their investors to really have thin margins to push growth as quick and as high as possible and to really push the limits in every way. So can you talk us through the margin of safety and how you might think about that in the context of startups?
I think about this differently, right? So I've started 4 different businesses at this point. And my goal, I can only say it through my lens. My goal with all of those businesses was to get to break even as quickly as possible. I think Y Combinator calls it like a ramen
Yep.
profitable, because I never wanted to be dependent on the kindness of strangers or outside investors in order to determine my future. I think what happens if we are too dependent on that, we end up not recognizing when things don't work. So we get a product and we sell it, but we're selling it. It's very inefficient because we have all this cash on the balance sheet. We can almost force sales. Like there's a lot of companies that I was proposed to invest in where they're spending more on marketing than they're getting in sales. And so every dollar of marketing is translating into like 60 cents of sales. And it's like, well, that doesn't work with your structure. It just doesn't flow that way. Like you can't continue to do that, especially if you're churning customers quickly. But those metrics become less important when you let somebody else. I think that's the big thing. You're letting somebody else determine what's important to you, and you're letting somebody else determine the scoreboard. So if you're running a business, you need to determine the scoreboard. Is that I'm going to be profitable and I'm going to be default alive, or I'm going to go as big as I can, as quick as I can. But you need to consciously do that, not because your investors are telling you to do that, not because they're influencing you to do that. But the minute you start walking down one of those paths, especially the investor one, where you're doing what they don't care. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, you're one of many allocations in their fund. Well, they'd like you to be successful. At the moment that you're not, they're just going to drop you. Like they don't really care about you as a person. They don't care about the company. They might care about the mission. They hope you're successful. But like you're working with these people that you need to take care of them. There's a responsibility that comes with that. And the best way, I think, to take care of those people is through profits.
Yeah. And that's your safety of your margin of safety is profitability, not needing to depend on anybody else. Yeah. And growing at, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about growing at a pace that makes sense.
So I mean, my default is sort of low debt, profitable. I don't want external circumstances to wipe us out. First thing I want to do is survive. Second thing I want to do is sort of take advantage of any fluctuations that may or may not happen. And people are saying, well, we didn't know interest rates were going to rise. And it's like, well, okay, you didn't study history. Like, how can you?
We thought ZIRP was going to last forever.
Yeah, we thought this time was different, right? And it's like, well, that's fine. If you're going to bet on that and you're consciously betting on it, then you were wrong. And there's a lot of people who are sort of well positioned right now to take advantage of that. And that's unfortunate. But there's a good market, I think, in terms of finding companies. Actually, if you have one of these companies, reach out to me. But like finding companies that are pushed by VCs to be bigger than they need to be into a market they shouldn't be in, that are niche profitable. I would love to talk to those businesses because we'd love to buy them.
Right. It's just like you have a business here. They're trying to make you something that you're not. And like you could have a really great cash flowing business that would be, the thing I've always been frustrated with is in Silicon Valley, you're either a venture-backed company or you're a quote lifestyle business, and I always found that to be so pejorative and it's so frustrating. Yeah. And we need to come up with a better term for like really solid, good, growing businesses that are not going to hockey stick forever and are not going to be billion-dollar companies, but are going to be fantastic companies that are going to be amazing. Do you have a good term for that?
Well, there's riches and niches, man. Like I think like trying to take a business that should be, $4 to $20 million a year in revenue and trying to make it like $1 billion business is just not a recipe for success or happiness in life. But if you own one of those businesses, just email me.
Let's see if we can get you some deal flow here. Okay. Yeah, so totally. I've been reading you for a while. I don't know, maybe close-ish to a decade. I don't know, something like that. I've always been curious, kind of what does a typical day look like for you?
With the exception of this month, which is sort of like a publicity month for the book, I don't take meetings in the morning.
And why is that?
Every morning is blank until 12 because I want to be able to focus on the thing that's most important to me, which usually is the biggest opportunity. But I also want to spend time with my kids. I don't want to be rushed. And I never want to have to find time to work on what's important to me. And so I just have no meetings until 12. And then that way I never have to find time to do the most important thing on my agenda. September is a bit of a different month where I'm doing a lot of interviews and a lot of publicity for the book. So I've like temporarily pause that rule. But starting
intentionally
October 3rd,
paused
when
it.
the book comes out, after the book comes out, a week after the book comes out, that rule is going back into place. And I'm just a happier person with that, right? And I learned this when I was working for the intelligence agency, which is I never had time to work on the things that were super important to me. And I was always usurped. All my time was like usurped by other people. And I was like, how do I do the things that I really want to do that add a lot of value, but they're long-term value? So it's really hard to find that time. And so I hit on this by looking at 3 or 4 months and then booking a 30-minute meeting with myself. But I couldn't have that for 3 or 4 months because I was so booked up until there. And then 3 or 4 months came around. I'm like, now I've got 30 minutes and this is great. And then so I just slowly started expanding it. And I got to 90 minutes working inside a large organization where I had 90 minutes every morning just for me. And I wouldn't use that to solve sort of other people's problems. I'd use it to work on long-term things that were super important to the organization that nobody ever really got the time to work on because we're so busy and we're caught up in operations and day to day. It's the same as business owners, right? You're so busy working in the business that you forget to work on the business. And I find that changing your perspective, going for a walk, doing all these things, but making concentrated effort. But if you have to find the time, you're never going to find it. You really have to create the time for yourself, set it aside.
It is a discipline, actually. It's a form of discipline to say that I am investing. It feels to me like an investment in quality because it's saying I'm putting boundaries around time to do deep work, deep thinking, and ideally the quality of my outcomes will be better because I'm doing that. But it feels like it's a huge trade-off. What I find is like, I'm also the same way. No morning meetings. I don't, my first meeting is at 2. But I also have like a structure of getting into the office is important to me. So I've got family time, office time, solo, and then, but I find that you fear setting that time aside is so fearful. You think you're going to lose so much by doing that. And what you realize is nobody really cares. Nobody cares. And you're actually performing better.
Yeah.
They can do a meeting at 12 as easily as they can do it at 9. And, that's going to be fine.
Again, going back to the defaults, right? Fears and emotions tend to make us not think well in situations that we're dealing with. So you want to make these decisions before you feel emotional, and you don't have to make them tomorrow. I think that's the big problem people get into is like, they know they should do this. Then they look at their calendar and they're like, they can't do it. They can't fit it in. So they get frustrated and they give up. But it's like, look out 3 months, look out 6 months, then block that time off, do it every day. There's a point in your calendar where you can start creating that. And that's the point where you want to start. You just have to get through from now until then. And when that day arrives, you're going to be like, oh my God, this is amazing. But often we just want to win the day, but we forget that we're really in this game to win the decade. And so like you can do all this urgent stuff, but like really what you're trying to do is win the decade. And you want to do that in a way that's sort of healthy and happy for you as well.
How many books do you read a year, and what books, we'll say in the last 18 months, have been most impactful for you?
Well, one of the books that have been the most impactful for me in the last 18 months is a 1926 book called Men and Rubber. And I first read this, I think it was about 17 or 16 months ago. And then I started buying all these copies of it and giving it away to friends. And it's by Harvey Firestone. And at one point, I think I owned like 10% of the world's supply of this. And I was tired of paying like $600 for books that I was giving away to friends that looked like, they were picked up at a garage sale. So we reached out to the Ford family and we sort of republished this book because I wanted to make it accessible for everybody. So if you go out and buy it, it was written in 1926. It's amazing. We just took the text, cleaned it up, edited it, well packaged it, and made it on Audible, Kindle, and everything, so that anybody who
at Farnham Street, or is it on Amazon?
Gotcha. Just go to Amazon. Yeah. And the goal with that was just to take a book that's already published and like literally just make it more accessible and make it cheaper for me to give away copies.
Now I can give it away to all my friends very easily. Well, I'm going to put that on my list for sure.
Yeah. And there's so much business wisdom in there. Because keep in mind, it was written in 1926.
What's interesting about it?
I just started reading it, and it was like about thinking and business and, how planning and forecasting work. And it's all through the lens of a very, very shrewd business operator. And it has the concept of positioning in it. So I'd already written about that in Clear Thinking, but then reading about it in this book was, how when you come across the idea that you have, and it gets reinforced, it was just a different way of looking at it, which I thought was brilliant. And so he talks about his father in the first chapter, and his father wasn't a successful business person, but the lessons he learned from his father, he applied to business and became incredibly successful. His father ran a farm, but he never wanted to work hard, but he was never out of position. He never borrowed money. He was often a lender of money to other people. He sort of gathered information, and the way he goes about this, you're like, oh, this book is as relevant today in 2023, language aside, and some of the cultural differences aside from the 1920s, as it was when it was written. And I love books like that. I love timeless books where the lessons sort of don't go away.
I am curious. Have you always considered yourself an intellectually curious person? And do you believe that that is a skill or a personality trait that one can develop over time?
I don't. I think you can develop it. I don't know if I've always considered myself intellectually curious. I was like a straight D student until high school, borderline getting kicked out of school. Like my teachers were telling me I'm lucky that I'd be lucky if I graduated. I think my grade 9 teacher actually wrote that in my report card. Shane, this is back when teachers wrote what they actually thought. And I'm quite sure, I think I still have it. She wrote Shane will be lucky to graduate from high school. And she was right? I wasn't interested in school, but that doesn't mean I wasn't intellectually curious, but I wasn't interested in somebody else telling me what to learn or what to write about or what to think. I really wanted to learn how to think. And my outlet was computers. I was super curious about computers. I would stay up all night in grade 9 playing on my computer. And anybody who's watched the movie Hackers, sort of the 1996 movie, I think, with Angelina Jolie, and that was me. I love doing that stuff. How do I program this? How can I make this do what I want it to do? And why does it always listen to me? And if I'm wrong, or if what I try to the code that I try to write is wrong, it's my fault. It's not the computer's fault. And so there's this really good feedback loop where it's oh, well, I'm wrong. I need to change what I'm doing so that I'm right. And then that got me really curious in more things. And it sort of opened the door to a different peer group, and it opened the door to university, and sort of had a big impact on my life.
I did not get intellectually curious. I wasn't even intellect. I was into other things until I was in grad school. And then I had this huge reading load, and then I would start randomly in my free time reading. And I was like, what am I doing? Who am I becoming? What's going on with my life?
I think it's hard to be curious when you're told what to read and what to do. And I think everybody is curious when they find something that they're really passionate about or something they care about. And that's a good signal that you care about it, is that you're curious about it.
Let's talk about fatherhood for a second. How has it impacted you as an entrepreneur? How do those two roles, being a dad and an entrepreneur, interplay with each other?
I don't think of it as balance. I think of life as a mosaic, and it has all these different parts to it. And so fatherhood is a part, running a business is a part, health is a part, relationships are a part. And those pieces can never really go away, but that doesn't mean that I hold them in equilibrium at all points in time. There's some times like September, which I talk to the kids about. They're teenagers now. So I'm like, this is a really busy month. After this month, it's going to go back more towards normal. But that means I'm going to spend less time with you than I normally do in this month. And, I just sort of work through these problems with them, which is hey, this doesn't mean I don't love you any less. This doesn't mean anything, but I'm a hands-on father. My rule for myself is I'm home every day when the kids get home from school. And so I think I've only violated that twice in the past 3 years. So every day I'm there when they leave for school, and I'm there when they get home from school. What time are they getting home? They get out of school at 3, they walk home. By the time they get home, it's 3:20. So putting together your day, no meetings until noon, home at 3:20. No meetings till noon. They start school they leave the house around 8, they get back at 3:20. And so that's my day. And within that, I got to fit in a workout. And if I don't, then I fit it in later because one of my rules is that I sweat every day. I
Gotcha,
work
yeah.
out every day. It doesn't matter. The duration can change, but the fact that I go
And are you
doesn't
logging
change.
back on
Uh,
later on in the day?
Sometimes, I mean, like if it's urgent or we're in the midst of a deal or we're making an investment or something, then I'm definitely a little more high touch. But when I'm with them, I try to be with them. But they're also teenagers. They've got homework. They've got their own thing going on. So what we do is we usually go for a walk, but I leave my phone at home when we go for a walk. So I'll leave it on the counter. We'll go for a walk, and that walk almost every day we'll go for a walk, and the walk varies from like, I don't know, 15 minutes on the low end to an hour on the high end. And I find as a parent, kids talk to me when they're walking a lot better than they talk to me when they're sitting at a
Interesting.
table. They're distracted. No eye contact. Like you can talk about all these different subjects that, they might find awkward or what's going on in their life. And, I just have them walk me through their day. And we used to do this. The way that I used to do this, I taught the kids when they get out of bed, they come cuddle with me in the morning. And that worked until they were about
Okay,
12
That's a
and
good run, though.
11. And now, yeah, so that was an amazing run. We had literally, it started at 4 and 3 and went to 12 and 11. And then I was like, well, that was the time we used to talk. And that was the time that I would really find out what's going on in their life. And so I was like, how do I create an environment where they're going to feel easier to talk to me, where there's going to be less friction, where we're not going to be rushed, where they're not going to be tempted by a screen. And so we just go for a walk. We walk around the block. Sometimes we walk the same loop. Sometimes we go a different loop. We're not running an errand. We're literally just going for a walk to talk. And I get them to walk me through their day. Like, what happened? What classes did you have? My oldest is in high school now. So it's like, he just started a new high school. And it's like, well, tell me about that. And they really open up a lot more than they do when you sit down and sort of like, and you can't force that conversation, which they come home. How is your day? They're like, good. They're grumpy. They drop their book bag. That's not the time. Right. But if, they come home, they put their book bag down, they shower, maybe they start their homework, maybe they don't, you give them a snack, and then you're like, hey, let's go for a walk. And you make that part of your ritual and routine. Now all of a sudden they're more conducive to talking to you. And I feel like being close to them is the most important thing. All the business stuff is it's great, but it's secondary to my relationship with them.
I love that. I may end up stealing that from you.
It's
cool idea.
Really powerful. Like it's surprisingly effective.
I want to talk, I kind of want to close out talking about mental models. I have really enjoyed your writing on mental models. You introduced me to it.
Oh, thanks.
And I've been working my way through the books. You have 2 or 3 volumes now of the mental model books.
We have 3 published, but we have 4 done. So the fourth and final book in the series is going to come out in October 2024.
Got you. Okay.
But that's done.
Fantastic. So, first of all, if someone that's watching this hasn't heard of mental models, what are they? Why were you drawn to the concept? What was like interesting to you about it?
So, mental models are simply a representation of how something works, and so you can't keep all the details in your mind. It's a distillation of an idea, concepts. That allows you to think through a problem, but you think in mental models because you look through a lens, and that lens tells you what's valuable in a situation and what to ignore in a situation. And if you use the right lenses, then you see the reality for what it is. And if you use the wrong lenses, then you miss stuff. And often we specialize. So we have very good mental models in our specialty field about what we're doing and how things work, but we forget the general mental models of life. The idea with the mental models books was to create sort of the 101 class. Like, what would I have learned if I took the 101 class in university of almost every major discipline? And how would those ideas that I learned apply to life? And so we included some thinking models like second order thinking and inversion, but we also included things like entropy, which sort of is a great one for business, because if you think of, there's an entropy to bureaucracy. Which is, if you don't apply energy to stop it, it will just expand and expand and expand and slow you down. And so you can take these concepts and you can apply them to life. Another one we talked about today is margin of safety. And how do we have the buffers? How do we position ourselves effectively? And you can also have mental models that are perspective taking, which is, how would Kyle think through this situation? Well, what is that doing? It's changing my perspective. And so why is that valuable? It's because the source of all bad decisions is blind spots. if we had perfect information about what happened and what will happen if we take a particular course of action, we would always make a
Yeah,
great decision. But we don't have perfect information, but we can use these mental models as lenses to see more of reality and uh, less through our own view. Like if we're walking through the forest and I'm with an environmentalist, they're going to see one thing. If I'm with a biologist, they're going to see another thing. If I'm with an engineer, they're going to see another thing. And if I'm with a landowner, they're going to see another thing. It's only through seeing through all of these eyes that we get a real picture of what the forest is and the impact of the decisions that we're making. And I think that we just don't think through things that way. And the idea came to me through Charlie Munger. And I sort of reached out to him and I was like, has anybody done this? Like, why isn't this available? And so I just created it. And I thought it would be a good thing to get back to the world and make easily accessible to people. And they're more of a reference book than more Encyclopedia Britannica sort of thing than they are popular.
You can
to
literally
read,
pick up
but
any
people
random
who-
any chapter and dive into that. One of the things I do, like the way I approach the book is I sit down as if I'm in a college course. I'm reading it. I actually do Audible. So I'll Audible and I'll take notes on each mental model. And I can only do that. I can only do like one chapter at a time when I'm doing that. But it's like so rich and so deep. And then I've got these like very good notes to kind of like fall back on. And it's been really a fun journey
thanks.
as a reader to dive into those. I'm curious if you have some mental models that you would highlight for somebody that's an entrepreneur or a founder or an operator of a startup.
Oh, we talked about so many today, right? So we talked about positioning, we talked about margin of safety, we talked about entropy. Second order thinking is a great one, which we didn't talk about directly, but sort of relates to the investor question we had, which is if you're being pressured by your investors, you take money. The question to ask yourself always is, and then what? Right? So if I do this particular course of action, now what? And sort of that allows you to start seeing the world through, okay, I've done this. Now, what does the world look like after that moment? And is that the world I want to operate in? Or are there things that we can do today to position ourselves so that we're less affected by that? A lot of things that we do are sort of first order positive, second order negative. An example of which is like eating a chocolate bar.
Very positive first order.
Right. You get this dopamine rush, like your insulin level spikes, you feel great, you get the sugar rush, the sugar high, and then second order effect, it comes a little later, but you get the crash. But also if you eat one chocolate bar, it's not going to make you unhealthy. But if you eat a chocolate bar every day, then sooner or later, you're going to be unhealthy. The gym is an example of something first order negative, second order positive. You go to the gym. I don't like going to the gym. I don't know about you. It's not my favorite thing to do, but I do it. I do that because I want to be healthy. So the second order benefit is that I'm healthier. Hopefully I can live a longer, healthier life. And I'm in a better position if I do get sick, which is inevitable, right? There's the inevitable ups and downs of life come, but I'll be in a better position my immune system will be functioning better. I'll withstand that storm a little better than I otherwise would have. If you're looking to start a business or you're looking for areas to compete in, anything that's first order negative, second order positive would be a great area to start applying that concept to, because most people don't want to do that stuff and they can't wait. Going back to the patience, a lack of patience changes the outcome. They can't wait for the reward. And so there's often sort of things you can do that are first order negative, second order positive. An example would be perhaps maintaining more inventory than you otherwise need to. It bloats your balance sheet. You got to report that to investors. But in a time of panic, you might be the only one with inventory available. Or if the supply chains, as they happened in COVID, get sort of like gucked up and you can't produce anything, you're the only one that can sell, and you can sell at a great margin. And so you can start thinking like you can relate that to positioning, but you can also relate it to thinking through the problem in a different way.
Hey, Shane, I really appreciated the time we've had today. Again, the new book coming out is Clear Thinking. And then where should people be following you?
Oh, you can go to fs.blog. You can send me an email, shane@fs.blog, if you have one of those businesses that you want to get rid of. I'm on Twitter at Shane A. Parrish. And you can just Google Shane Parrish and everything will come up. The podcast is called The Knowledge Project.
Well, hey, appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Kyle.